going to explore qualitative research approaches that are specific to the dissertation. So there are some other less common ones, including things like grounded theory, but those would not be dissertation qualitative research approaches. Those would be post-dissertation, just looking for a more experienced researcher. So in this one, we're really just going to hone in on 4, and that's going to be narrative research, which specifically studies lives through stories, and it focuses on an identity, a kind of fundamental turning point either in time or in a society or a culture, and then the meaning that that has had across a time period. So in narrative research, it's really kind of this idea that I'm seeing lives plural, so not just one person, that's important. I'm also focused on those lives' identities, so plural, multiple people's identities, different turning points, so not just one turning point that happened, and then how that looks over time. And so that's going to be important, and you'll kind of see as I get into more of the specific approaches. Then we have phenomenology, and really this is an essence of lived experiences. And again, plural, so there are multiple lived experiences and looking for a shared meaning across different people. And it's really important that when you're thinking about phenomenology, you're telling someone else's story. And it's important to tell their story while looking for shared themes and meanings that might be in multiple stories that you got to hear and experience. In an ethnography, this is different because it's immersive. So it's not just that you're studying someone's life from the outside or that you're exploring this lived experience in an interview. You are a part of that group. So you join that group and you participate actively in that group. And you kind of have this dual role of observing what's happening within the culture and talking to people within the culture and reflecting on your own experiences within that culture to really dig into beliefs, rituals, practices, and shared values in that cultural group. And then you have a case study, which is more about depth than breadth. So a case study is a really in-depth examination of a single case. Now, a single case doesn't necessarily mean a single person. It could be a single school, so there could be multiple people you're talking to in a school, in a program, or an organization. It can be singular with a single person, but that's not typically a doctoral level study. That would often be far too narrow. And so kind of thinking about these 4 methods, what they all have in common is that they're powerful. Anytime we're able to share meaning and explore lived experiences, those resonate with humans. And so qualitative research really has this element of humanness to it. And it's very difficult, at least for me, to read qualitative research and not connect to things on that basic human level. So it's powerful because it speaks to me in a very different way than quantitative speaks to me. Quantitative has these impactful conclusions and statements, whereas qualitative research pulls on that empathy and that compassion and those human elements of us. And that's why in qualitative, really we're answering the how and the why of something, and we're trying to uncover the depth of what's happening in the human itself. So human behavior is always complex. It's never simple. And so qualitative research is kind of peeling the onion back on all of those layers and pulling back to look at that really complex idea. And so if we kind of dig into narrative research, it's really studying people's lives through stories. So if you're a history buff, we know our earliest history is passed down through stories from generation to generation. So narrative research can take on a timeline perspective because you could be looking at the stories that have been passed down through generations. You could be looking at stories from multiple perspectives that occurred at a specific turning point in time. But a lot of times we're focused in on like what's the identity of that person and what happened to them through that story. And so we'll use words like tell, explore, understand. And because we're looking at people's stories, that it could be an interview, but when someone's telling you their story, think more of like when you have those interviews and you see them on TV where it's not like a ping pong match. So it's not like I ask you a question, you answer, you and repeat, repeat, repeat. It's things like, so tell me about what it felt like. Like they're much bigger, open questions because it should be very little of the interviewer talking and more of the person telling their story. So interviews can be challenging in that way. Diaries then make complete sense because a diary is someone telling the story in their own first person perspective. It could be letters because the culmination of a bunch of letters could tell the story of what happened. And in a similar way, so could have emails. And so when we take those data sources in and we're analyzing them, we're really looking for within their stories, what are the key events that they have in common? What are the people that they have in common? What are the different settings that they have in common? And what are any turning points that they have in common so that at the end of all of that, we're able to retell that story, identifying those key points and relating those key points back to the whole thing we're trying to study. So that might feel a little abstract, but we'll have some examples that we can pull from within the readings and within class, but that's definitely a key point of this. And so, again, when we're talking about that data analysis, there are just multiple different ways for each type of qualitative research to be done. So like a diary might not always be appropriate. An interview might be more of a ping pong than a storytelling experience. So just keep that in mind, that just even saying that like the way we're going to gather information is this one method, it's really everything is going to be shaped by this. And so a phenomenology is studying that essence of lived experience. And if you're a STEM person like me, the first time I read that, I was like, that's a really intangible idea, like the essence of something. And what I think it kind of equates to when I've studied it, I did a recent study that was phenomenological, and really it was trying to get down to the intangible things that were happening in their lived experiences. So what were the emotions? Were there anxieties? Were there struggles that weren't transparent if I was just reading a book about someone? But because I'm getting to truly hear their lived experience, it's almost like they're narrating their emotions to us. And so we're really digging into those intangible pieces and not so much of what happened, but how did that make you feel? How did you react to that? How did that shape your life and your experience? And so what the focus becomes then is these really intense, rich interactions where we're talking to people. And essentially what we'll do is we'll say, okay, we've talked to 10 people in a phenomenology. You're going to have longer periods of time that you're talking for those people. And you're going to be looking for, like, are there any shared meanings? And so, for instance, in mine that I studied, I actually found that when I looked at artificial intelligence and specifically talked to people with dyslexia, there was a really profound sense of trauma that people with dyslexia had experienced in the pre-artificial intelligence time, and that post-artificial intelligence, they're actually seeing a significant reduction in those traumatic interactions and experiences that are allowing them to feel more confident in different ways and really just listening to their experience and how they live their life both pre and post artificial intelligence allowed me to find those types of shared meanings, and it was such an illuminating experience. And so in phenomenology, we look for describe, understand, and explore. But again, we're describing, understanding, and exploring not the physical things that happen, but really like what is that internal monologue of those things. And so those data sources, again, they look different. So in this case, we are interviewing them, but we're not talking about what shaped your identity. We're talking about basically there's this phenomenon that's happened. This phenomenon has occurred. And how did it change you fundamentally as a person? How did you live through that? What were your thoughts, your emotions, those types of things? Much more powerful. And in diaries, instead of looking at that narration element, now we're trying to pick up on like what were the emotions and the nuances, and how can we look at the language that was used to point out those things. When I'm looking at an interview, I'm paying attention to like tightness in the eyes and the shoulders and really trying to understand the subtext of what's happening. And so we look for those things, the significant statements, the meaning units, the themes, and the essence in that body language and that unspoken piece. And we're really just trying to describe what is this like for these people? What was it like to go through this phenomenon? And so again, that data analysis, they've got very similar things here, but the whole approach to what you're gathering changes. And that's kind of the key piece in qualitative, is that how you're looking at taking that information in, it has very different goals. So you must holistically approach it differently. And mentally, you really have to frame this very strongly in your mind to correctly execute these ways. And in ethnography, it's a lot about cultures and groups. So we are looking at entire cultures or subgroups of cultures, and in order to understand their beliefs, rituals, practices, and shared values, we become a part of that group or culture, which can exclude certain researchers, because if we don't make sense to be a part of that group, we can't conduct an ethnography successfully. So to do this, there's a level of trust happening between both the researcher and the group that's at a whole different level of consent. You are consenting to let me into your life, into all of your beliefs and your practices and your rituals, to actively participate in them so that I can better understand them from a shared perspective and experience of experiencing it with you. And so in here we're looking at like what are the cultural rules, both spoken and unspoken, that are guiding that life, those interactions, the way that they believe what they believe. Those key questions, again, very similar: understand, explore, and describe. But now, in order to do those things, you are immersing yourself in them. And this can be a very tough one to do, because remember, we've got to cage our bias. We have to be very intentional when we do this qualitative research. And so this can be a very difficult method. And so a lot of these data sources become observations of what's happening during these times, taking field notes. Now you're conducting interviews, but the interview doesn't have a let's sit down and interview feel to it. We're asking natural questions as these events are happening. So it's not like let's set aside an hour to go sit and interview. It's more of I'm a researcher taking part in your cultural group. Can I ask questions when things are happening to better understand them? And so there could be an aspect of cultural artifacts that are being brought into this. And so the analysis here, it's very nuanced. There can be codes looking at those observations, those field notes, those interviews, and looking for emerging themes. It could also be cultural categories and comparisons that are being made, and overarching cultural themes that are happening, like from beliefs to rituals to practices to values, and looking across all of those for those overarching themes. And so the end product is really a rich description And the way that I read this is almost like it's painting a picture in your head of this culture or group. And because you've taken part in it, you can never have the same experience as people who've lived it their whole lives, but it does give you a lot of capabilities that someone who is just an observer wouldn't have. So it's very different in that aspect. And we'll talk about that like in a case study to contrast that. So again, here we have field notes and artifacts entering for the first time. But again, all of this is being driven by the fact that the observations are my first person observations, as well as what I'm observing about the group around me, because I am participating in that grouping. And so case study takes ethnography though, and it's like you're putting like a wall between you and the group. So it's kind of like when you're looking on the TV shows and they've got the mirror in the interrogation room. In a case study, you're kind of that person behind the mirror. You're watching but not taking part in anything. And the goal is different in a case study. So you're not trying to dig into the essence of someone and that rich personal emotional narration and thought process that you are in a phenomenology. And we're also not doing a narrative over time. A case study is really looking at a single case that could be a school, a program, an event, an organization. It could be the pandemic. And we're trying to develop a comprehensive understanding of that single, specific, unique thing that happened. So it has the same idea of a phenomenology, but we're not trying to look at it from an essence. We're trying to look at it holistically and comprehensively, which is going to be a bit more of a structured approach. And this is often a more popular method because it has more ground rules that are more apparent to new researchers. And so here we're trying to, you notice the word examine gets brought in. So it's like an examination, it's an exploration, it's understanding, but it's no longer like an emotional understanding or even an internal understanding. We are looking much more at those external factors and events, and we are looking at the events themselves and the physical things that happen more in a case study. So here we're going to have those interviews, and they're going to be more transactional, more of that ping pong. We're going to be observing, but we're not really observing looking for those like deep emotional tells or essence tells. We're really just observing lightly what's happening, which is why you see a report. We could be looking at reports. We could be looking at artifacts related to the case. That could be email exchanges between people in those situations. It could be reports put out by organizations. And really, in a case study, we want to have triangulation from multiple sources. Because again, we are looking to validate what's going on in this case. And again, we can't really triangulate different people's inner monologues and essences and cultural belief systems. But in a case study, I should be able to see evidence of those physical things happening in multiple places. And so the output of this is a detailed case narrative or case report that provides in-depth insights. And so one of the things that I can provide is I did publish a case study recently. And you can see in my case study, I triangulated emails, I triangulated like meeting transcripts and happenings and data. And I was triangulating that, and that was very different than my phenomenology that I did on artificial intelligence, where I was really looking at the essence of people. And so contrasting those two articles and listening to this video, I think will be really helpful to help you kind of tease that out. And so in that case narrative, it is really just kind of a less of all of the qualitative methods, and I don't want to make this a rule, but it is somewhat less oomph to it because it doesn't have the human aspect as much as a narrative or phenomenology or an ethnography would say. I would say the ethnography and the phenomenology really appeal on a deep human level. And then you have your narrative and your case studies that just are a a lighter, less depth section of this where we're still studying something, but we're making comparisons. We're looking at the events that happened and less that internal narration. And it could be a very specific location, organization, any of that in that case study. And so that's kind of a look at these big 4 pieces. And whatever type you choose, we still in qualitative research have to think about the credibility, the transferability, the dependability, and the confirmability. So quantitative research, we have all kinds of guidelines around how to generalize this to a population. In qualitative, we have to consider the accuracy of our findings. So that can be in an interview, just did I hear you say this? Is it accurate to summarize what you said as this? It could be having someone else sit in on the interview with you and you're checking their codes against your codes. So with my externs, I would code an interview. I would have them code an interview, and then we would meet to compare and see what we aligned on and what we didn't and have that discussion. So that brought credibility to what we were doing. For transferability, that's really those rich details. So readers can actually apply those findings in other places. So basically, if I can't describe what I'm trying to do in detail enough that someone else could say, oh, that's similar to this thing over here, then I've not done my job as a qualitative researcher. Dependability, there has to be a documentation trail. So if you're using Deduce as a software, you've got memos, you've got audits, you've got days, times, transcripts, all of these things, there's a paper trail to support everything that you did. Now, is every person on the street going to ask you for that? No, but it should be available. And then confirmability means really paying attention to your bias. So you should be memoing before you talk to people, after you talk to people, because kind of emptying your mind of all of your thoughts allows you to be more open to what someone else says without putting your interpretation on it. And it's something that the more you practice it, the more you'll start to notice that you've said what you need to say, so now you can really just listen and really focus in on what they are communicating to you as a researcher.